All right, picking up right where we left off. I just got a quick phone call, so I took that. Now moving on back to Daf. We left off discussing where we left off in the middle of Etrog. We were in the middle of Daf Lamed Hey. We finished Daf Lamed Hey, which the third point was, to recap, was that if you have an Etrog that the pitum falls off, and it's left pitamato, makes a puzzle. Okay, then moving on to Daf Lamed Vav. Lamed Vav is going to be discussing the first point is if you have a Etrog, we're discussing the Etrog topic, so Daf Lamed Vav discusses when you have an Etrog that has simanei treifa, if it has different psulim, like an animal would have a simanei treifa that wouldn't survive, it wouldn't live. Is it a problem? And we say, are they the same comparisons when you have an animal it's a treifa compared to an Etrog? Look at the discussion there, and the second point on Daf is discussing if you use a mold for an Etrog. If you have something that shapes the Etrog to be something that's unnatural, it might be a problem. If it's changing the shape from something that does not look like a natural shape of an Etrog to be like a star or to be like the shape of a pomegranate. Okay, moving on to discuss the third point of Daf Lamed Vav is that when Rabbi Yehuda has a shita, I think it's Rabbi Yehuda, that you have to only bind the arba minim using something that's part of the arba minim. And you can use the lulav branch if you fold it over to bind the arba minim. Rabbi Yehuda says you can only use that to bind it, not let's say string or something like that. Okay. Moving on to Daf Lamed Zayin is laser tag. First point of Daf is going to be discussing that within also Rabbi Yehuda as well, I believe, has a shita that you could only use the arba minim for your schach, so you'd have to use some sort of lulav branch or whatever it may be, or whatever you else want to do, hadas aravot, hard to do with an etrog, to make it something that probably can't, I don't know. But anyway, they have to use arba minim for the skach of a sukkah. And the second point off is going to be discussing one can smell a etrog, but one cannot smell hadas because it's not for its purpose. And the third point off is what's the meaning of na'anu? When you shake the lulav of an etrog, what exactly is the purpose behind it? Moving on to Daf Lamed Chet. We're advancing. Daf Lamed Chet is going to be lach, davar lach, something that's liquidy, which reminds us of chicken soup. That's the siman. So chicken soup reminds us of the first point on the daf, that when you are in the middle of a meal on Shabbos, let's say, we say you interrupt your meal to daven mincha if you realize, that you haven't daven mincha yet and it's coming close to a time where you can't daven mincha, as opposed to, or if it's minyan, whatever it may be, as opposed to when it comes to shaking the lulav, we do not interrupt you on your meal to shake the lulav. Interesting comparison, discussion. Look at the discussion over there. Daf Lamed Chet. Point number 2 is how does Hallel become the way it is? When we have the formulations of Hallel, what can we learn about the fact that we repeat the same lines 2 times in a row? And at certain points of times where Hallel was responsive from the Chazan, when you had back in the day, they used to have a katan or someone else who would be motzi other people, or people who would be motzi other people that are on the same level of chiyuv as them. How would it work? And from there, we could see how Hallel is formulated nowadays. Why we repeat some of the double phrases from the Prakim and that really only have them once. Interesting idea. Look at that over there. Moving on to the third point of Daf Lamed Chet is Shomei Kon, a very famous principle, and that allows us to be able to listen and be yotzei, as if we're actually responding. Moving on to Daf Lamed Het, which is a letter. For the first point, Daf is going to be discussing that we had kol a mitzvah mevarach alem over l'asiyata. You make a bracha immediately before doing a mitzvah. When it comes to halal, the Gemara discusses there. Famous principle throughout all of Shas. And look at Psachim Dav Zayin, cool stuff. Zichru. Moving on to the next point on Daf is going to be discussing that we have kol bracha mevarach alem over l'asiyata by halal. And the second point on Daf, which reminds us that now moving on to Dinei Shvius, which is apropos to this year, when it comes to gifting a lulav and etrog during a Shvius, you cannot gain a profit, so to speak. So what we would do is I believe it was something along those lines, that we thought at this point that etrog was included in Shvius, but lulav wasn't. So you'd gift the etrog within the lulav and hadassah and ravot set. So it's like you say $200 total, even though it was $160, and the etrog was $40. So you'd group it all together and it would be totally fine. So you give it as a matana together. It's a good chap, a good way to get around it. Okay, moving on to the next point on daf is going to be that you could give a poor person, sorry, not a poor person, but am aretz. You give an am aretz enough money from Demei Shvius in order to supply him for 3 meals, but if you supply him for more money than that, then he might end up using it for not Kodesh purposes. So basically, you cannot do that. You don't trust him to be able to follow the Dinei Shvius of Kedusha Shvius properly. And for Demei Shvius, which is money that has a chalos of Shvius on it, it has the status of Shvius Kedusha. Moving on to Daf Mem. Moving on to the 4th set. We're going to have to go to Vav, so we got another, let's call it 17 minutes if we're lucky. Moving on to Daf Mem. First point is Mayim. Maybe it'll be quicker. Need to stop and go faster. I know them, did them recently. Daf Mem is Mayim. First point of the Daf is going to be discussing when you have a lulav. We discussed that maybe it does have Kedushat Shvius, and other things like like regular eitzim do not have to use shvius because the lulav might have a different purpose. He used to use it for sweeping the floors. It was a good broom, so to speak. It has a nice shake. Anyway, that was the first point daf mem. Second point daf mem is going to be discussing machlokas about how we are going to be mechalelis shem shvius and something. If it could be whether only through derech mekach or through derech kiddush or nechilo as well. Moving on to the third point of daf mem is that avakos shvius, those who actually work the land during shvius will become more successful, and those who do all the way around, those who work the land during shvius will become poor and they will lose out in business, and those who do not work the land, it's a promise to them that they will be able to have enough sufficient resources and they will become more wealthy. They will become more supplied through observing shvius properly. We have this idea of Shabbos as well, famous stories, obviously, with shvius. So, interesting idea. Avakos shvius, that's the way the Gemara describes it. Moving on to daf mem aleph. That was mem aleph. Mem aleph. My aleph is grandma. Mem aleph. Moving on, first point of daf is going to be discussing when you have a we say first point daf is going to be Zichru Mikdash. We take the lulav for all 7 days. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai says, even though in the Mikdash they only did it for those 7 days, but everywhere else outside they would only do it for 1 day. And the first day we say that applies nowadays. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai says that we do shake the lulav all 7 days, which is what we do for a while now. Moving on to the second point of daf mem aleph is going to be discussing yomanif kulo aser, that when it comes to the chadash they would bring the korban. So at one point in time we were concerned when the Beit HaMikdash would be rebuilt if they would be able to bring the chadash. If we knew that they would only bring the chadash korban at the 15th, at the 16th would become the new grain would become permitted for since the korban was brought. Complicated discussion, look over there. Anyway, that's the point of daf nun mem aleph, and the third point on daf is going to be matana manat lahachzir, giving it on the condition that you got it back. Because the discussion there in the Gemara, daf mem bet is a mobster. So the first point on daf is going to be discussing people that did not want to be Yotzei when they went out shaking the lulav. When they would walk outside, they would flip it upside down. That way they wouldn't be Yotzei because they're not holding it, they're harori, they're fit way to carry the lulav. Second point on daf is that when you have a katan, how are you going to educate him in order to fulfill the mitzvah? At what age? At what stage? And moving on to the third point in daf is going to be Gezerah the Rabbah, famous Rabbah's Gezerah to Kanat the Rabbah, that the reason why we do not shake the lulav on Shabbos, and the reason why we don't blow a shofar on Shabbos, and the reason why we don't take Orlay and Megillah on Shabbos for Purim is because of the Gezerah Shema Yeholech Arba Amos B'Shut Rabbim, to learn about Baki, to do different things. So that's why we have this famous Gezerah the Rabbah, which applies in many different areas. Big topic. Moving on to Daf Mem Gimel, which is the magazine. First point is Hayom Bayom Afil B'Shabbos. We say that when it comes to the hechsher mitzvah of taking off the lulav from the tree, whatever it may be, bottom line is we say that Bayom Afil B'Shabbos. It's the way Gemara phrases it, and the second point of Daf is going to be discussing that if one uses the Rava, we say you still use it on the 7th day, even if it's on Shabbos, Doche Shabbos, the Rava. The way they would do the ceremony. And the third point is confusing, is the way they would do the Rava ceremony. They would stand them up, whether it be Zikifa or Benetila, how they fulfill the mitzvah of standing upright, which moves to Daf Mem Dal, which is the mud, which reminds the Kohen and Baalei movement could fulfill their service in the Rava service. They would be kosher, I believe. The second point of Daf is that we say is Arava Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im. I always get confused with that one, so it's good I got it for the video. Yesod Nevi'im or Minhag Nevi'im. Gemara discusses that, and the third point is taking the Arava all alone. Is that going to be fine? Is that kosher? Similar to how we mentioned on Daf Lamed Hey. If you take on Daf Lamed Hey about taking on Daf Lamed Dal about taking that trick all alone. Okay, so taking the Arava all alone is Daf Mem Daled and also Lamed Daled. Fits well. A third point for each actually. Yeah. Okay. Now we move on to Daf Mem Hey. Mem Hey is going to be discussing the Daf Mem Hey is monopoly. First point is going to be discussing that the Rav has to be 11 amos tall to be able to drape over the top of the Mizbeach, which stands on the base of the Yisod Mizbeach. Beautiful. The second point Daf is going to be famous pasuk Isru Chav Bavotim Akar Mizbeach. Gemara discusses what does it mean Isru. What does it mean? Interesting. Gemara gives different interpretations of what it means. And third point on Daf is going to be famous principle of Lamed Vav Tzadikim. Where does it come from? Sukkah Daf Mem Hey. There you go. Lamed Vav Tzadikim. Gemara discusses in the pasuk that uses the low Lamed Vav. Okay. Bottom line is Lamed Vav Tzadikim. Daf Mem Vav is going to be Mu. Cow goes Mu. First point of Daf is going to be discussing when you have the opportunity to make a leisha b'sukkah multiple times, you have to make it every single time you sit up and down in the sukkah, every time you go out to eat. At what point in time do you make leisha b'sukkah? Famous question, people always ask, confusing question perhaps. Second point of daf is going to be discussing how to find a mitzvah hard, but you have a lot of mitzvah you could do at once. Which mitzvah should take precedence? What dot. And the third point of that was going to be discussing when do the etrog and lulav become mutter b'hana? When can you eat the etrog and make the etrog jelly, make the etrog, whatever you may want to make out of it, if it's edible, and have it after Sukkah, during Sukkah. Gemara discusses that. Gemara discusses how they would bite into the etrogs and they would take the kids' etrogs and bite them and show their excitement. However you understand that Gemara, maybe the kids would take them. Anyway, once it became mutter, so at what point in time do they become mutter? Gemara discusses that. Famous agata, obviously, about, like I said, about snatching the etrogs and be able to eat them from the kids' hands almost. Moving on to daf Mem Zayin. Mem Zayin's a maze. The first one daf is going to be discussing. We're in the last 9 dafim from Mem Vav to Nun Vav, so now we're Mem Zayin. Nice stuff. Mem Zayin is the maze. So the first point is Shvi is suffix Shmini. When it comes to Shmini Atzeret, we're not sure, are you chayav to eat in the Sukkah or not? Is it considered to be the 8th day? Is suffix Shmini, suffix Shvi? Okay, discussing a whole long discussion about Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galios and Suffolk and when you're chayav to eat in the Sukkah, which brings us to the second point on daf of Mem Zayin, which is discussing when you make a bracha shachyan, you make a bracha shachyan by Shmini Atzeret, discussing that principle which relates to the first point of suffix Shvi Shmini, or Shvi suffix Shmini. The Gemara discusses it as the 7th day and the suffix about the 8th day. Okay, moving on. The third point of Mem Zayin is whether or not Lina applies to by Shmini Atzeret, the korban out there, I believe, Lina applies. And moving on to Mem Chet, which are the brainiacs, Moach, which means brain, so brainiacs, which reminds you of the first point of they were determined. How do you determine, or what is the source for Simcha by Shmini Atzeret? Second point of daf is going to be discussing what the pasuk says, Ushavta Mayim B'Sasom. What does that mean? And the whole interesting got of Sason to Simcha. Anyway, look over there. And Gemara discussed that for a while. Moving on to the third point of daf, Mem Chet, which is the 3 times they walk up on the left side of the ramp in the Mizbeach, for the Mizbeach, in the Beit HaMikdash, which relates back to Yoma, earlier Masechet, where we discussed on daf Chav Gimel or somewhere along those lines about where they would walk up the sides of a ramp. They'd walk up the middle of the ramp, actually. Right by Emtzah Mizbeach, right? There was no concern that it'd be. Okay, anyway, look at the Yom over there, somewhere in the middle of the Chafs. There's a discussion about that. We can look back into Zichru and try and determine more accurately, but Zichru allowed me to remember that, so just have to narrow it down by reviewing it, which is a big point of what I'm doing right now, is reviewing this, heading into Chag of Sukkos one more time, moving into daf Mem Tet. As we finish Mem Chet, Mem Tet is a meat. So first point is Bereshis. We say, maybe it's Barashis. Maybe it means that Hashem created this Yisod for the water they would pour in, and maybe it has a lot more significance to it than what is, Nesach HaMayim, famous ideas of what really is going on here, a foundation of the world. Okay, look at the, loudest discussions to look at on Daf Mem Tet. Second point is 2 different psukim, 2 different ideas that relate to Stuck and Gimut Chasadim. The first point is that we say there's 3 different ways that Gimut Chasadim is better than Stucka. And the third point is towards Chesed Lashona, always telling the truth. More discussions about that pasuk over there from Eshet Chayil, which also is known as Mishlei Daf, Perek Lamed Aleph, last Perek of Mishlei. Okay. Lamed Aleph, I think. Anyway, Daf Nun is going to be discussing Nincompoop for Nun, which the first point of Daf is going to be discussing the start of the 5th. The start of the first point is the end of the 4th Perek, which discusses that if the golden barrel they would use in order to get the water out, and all different discussions about there. The start of the 5th parak is the second point, which is talking about the chalil, the flute they would use for shira. It was dochet Shabbos. It was not dochet Shabbos and Yantif, I believe so. And it wasn't dochet, I think. And the third point is that the Moshe Rabbeinu seems to have a klei sharis, a flute that was wooden, and maybe klei sharis could be kosher when they're asatan me, when they're made from it. Okay, look at that, cool stuff. Moving on to Daf Nun Aleph, last 6 daf of Daf Nun Aleph is going to be discussing. Daf Nun Aleph is the na. Good siman because beavers na, non Aleph, and beavers also, we make beaver pelt hats. So beaver pelt hats reminds us of the first part of Daf is that whether or not the Iker Shira is Bepet or Iker Shira Bekli when it comes to the avoid of the Mikdash. And the second point of is that there are multiple statements where it says if someone didn't see this, they did not see a true definition of Simcha, let's say by Simcha Beit HaShoeva, then if they never saw Simcha Beit HaShoeva, they never saw the true definition of Simcha, as well as they never Misha Lo Ra'a at Beit HaMikdash Binyanao, Rishlan, Betifarta, and then they have never really seen this true example of what it means to, be wow at a building of Beit HaMikdash. and Yerushalayim, and when it was rebuilt, as well as which the Gemara brings us the third point is, if you haven't seen the Dioplusteron, the palace, or not really palace because it was a shul, but the giant shul they had in Alexandria, where they'd raise the flags to show that people could say Amen now because they couldn't hear from the other side of the room because it was that large, then you never really saw a true shul. Okay, beautiful discussion. Daf Nun Bet is going to be discussing on a similar vein. Nun Bet reminds us of the newbies to Yiddishkeit. So the Gemara moves on to tangent discussing the Yetzer Hara on this stuff, which the first point is how they would know they would be able to build Ezer Nashim, the balcony where the woman would stand during the Sukkah B'Dei Shreiva. That way it would not lead to different scenarios where there was intermingling, whatever it may be. So based off that, they would have how do they know they could have a source from a pasuk that they determine that they could actually build a balcony for the woman to stand upon to be involved in the Simcha. So how do we know this? We learned it out from the pasuk. So if by Simcha B'Dei Shreiva you can have Ezer Nashim. Okay, that's the first point. Second point, right, and that's related to Yetzer Hara because of the fact that there were men and women together. Bottom line is, so that they found out a way that this was a good way of allowing things to be able to run and operate smoothly. The second point off is that the tzaddikim will be shown the Yetzer Hara, and they'll be see this is such a large mountain. How can we overcome it? But they do overcome it eventually. They were able to get build their way up and climb their way up and be able to overcome these challenges that's them viewed as a large challenge, but they can overcome them. It's surpassable. As opposed to their Sham, they'll look at the Yetzer Hara and they'll say, it's just, it's so small, it's a string, it's a hair, it's as thin as a string. Yeah, they still struggle by it. They still aren't able to surpass this tiny mountain, and they seem to succumb to the Yetzer Hara. Okay. And the third point off is the 7 names of the Yetzer Hara on Daf Nun Bet. We discussed a lot more of them. 7 names. Okay. Moving on to Daf Nun Gimel, which just leaves us with interesting stories as well about the Malach HaMavis and David Melech and Shlomo Melech as opposed to David Melech. Sorry, Shlomo Melech. Yeah, I think it was Shlomo, not David. So basically there was a story of 2 list grabs for Shlomo, and we end up determining in the story that if a person's feet are as guarantors, a person is meant to have something be decreed against him, he will end up walking into his din, so to speak. And these people were killed when they went into the city of Luz, and the Malach HaMavis knew that they would kill them at this area, and basically Shlomo Melech sent them away, and they walked there. I really don't remember if it was Shlomo or David, which is a minor point, but this message of the story stands clear. A person's feet are as guarantors. The second point on Daf is going to be discussing that they would not sleep during the Simcha B'Dei Shreiva in times of Beit HaMikdash. They would be constantly up, all the festivities. They would have a person juggling, Rav Shimon Gamliel would be juggling 8 torches, which is against world record. So Ari Leibowitz printed out from a friend. Guess the current Guinness Book world record is 7 torches. So Vukosh 8 were being tossed in the air, 8 torches. It was a huge sight. They would not sleep for days on end. Okay, and moving on to the third point on Daf Nun Gimel, which was the fact that on Daf Nun Gimel, they would not sleep at night, as well as the fact they would not sleep Simcha B'Dei Shreiva. Person's feet are as guarantors is the first point. Second point, they want to sleep on Simcha B'Dei Shreiva. And the third point, I almost forgot this for a second. It leads us into Naftum Dalid. At the end of Nun Gimel, discusses that the source did have 15 steps for Shir inside the Beit HaMikdash, correlating to the 15 Shir Amalos Prakim that we have in Tehillim, the last set of 15 over there inside of Sefer Tehillim. Moving on to the first point of Daf Nun Daled, which is noodles, which relates to the previous point of Daf Nun Gimel, which discusses that how do we know, or the discussion is that they would blow on the 10th step the tekios from the shofar and of the 15 steps over there. And the second point is that for every single musaf offering they would bring, they would add another 9 tekios. And the third point of Daf Nun Daled is interesting how they would intercalculate. They would determine to make sure that the schedule will never allow, that the calendar will never allow for Yom Kippur to fall out on a Sunday, that we would have Shabbos into Yom Kippur. That would be pretty tough. Okay, which does not happen nowadays. And then move on to Daf Nun Hey, the second to last Daf in the Masechet. It discusses Daf Nun Hey is 55 mile per hour speed limit. Okay, beautiful Siman. Discussing that, the first point on Daf is going to be that the lengths of the tekios would lengthier. They would lengthen. They would become longer as time would go on. And the second point on Daf is discussing that the Shivim Parim connects to the Shivim Amimim. The 70 different nations connect to the Shivim Parim. If only the nations knew that these korban were being brought for them and they were staying in the world, they would probably come to Beit HaMikdash. And the pasuk of Av Yosim would be fulfilled. And moving on to Daf Nun Hey, the third point on Daf is that we say that all of the Kohanim would have received parts of the Imorim, the different parts of the Korbanos, they would receive their portion. And the last Daf in the Masechet Daf Nun Vav is Nu, the Shul Shusher, as the Siman goes, and the first point is going to be discussing when you have the bracha of Shechianu, at what point would you make it when you were sitting down in Sukkah? The Gemara reverts back to this discussion, and the second point of Daf is going to be discussing when you have the Lechem Panim divisions, how would they divide it up to make sure all the Kohanim would get, and similar to the discussion that we had on Daf in Masechet Yoma, which discusses divisions of Lechem Panim on an earlier Daf. Okay, then move on to Daf known above point number 3, which is that way the Gemara ends off for discussion, the Mishmar of Miriam Bilga, and associating yourself with someone bad and committing evil acts, and those acts was something that she was remembered by, and they affected the entire Mishmar. Yashar Korach, everyone, that was Masechet Sukkah, all known Vav Dapim, going through it with Zichru. Thank you very much to Avram Goldhar and for my Chavrusa to be able to go through each Chavrutot I go through the Zichru Simanim with, so I'm thankful to them. And thank you to Zichru as well for allowing me to held into Chag Sukkos, having categorized the 56 Dapim of Masechet Sukkah. Yashar Korach, have a great Chag Sameach, everyone.